Clouds out there at the sunset tonight and some wild storms passing through the area, but I think all is good now. And as we are here on the evening of May 19th, recording this live devotion for our Read Through the Bible series, we're going to look at the first part of our Old Testament reading, which is from 1 Samuel chapter 24. And it's the account of David sparing Saul's life near En Gedi. It's very clear that one of the themes that we see here is that David had reverence for the office of kingship in Israel. He refused to kill Saul, for Saul had been anointed by God. David was bothered, in fact, that he had been so bold as to cut off the hem of Saul's robe. Saul, on the other hand, had by this time forfeited his claim to the privileges of being the anointed king of Israel. And David had already been anointed as the new king to replace Saul. Nevertheless, David showed great respect for God's original choice. Later on, David expressed trust that God would remove Saul when it was appropriate to do so, and until that time, he refused to raise his hand against Saul. Although Saul was deeply flawed and at times opposed to God's will, as the anointed one of Israel, he in fact prefigured the greater anointed one, Jesus Christ. And when Saul managed to defend Israel from its enemies, he also foreshadowed Jesus' deliverance of his people from the powers of sin, death, and the devil. Therefore, in refusing to attack Saul, David was honoring the Christ yet to come. A second theme that dovetails with the theme we just described is that God desires for us to have respect for authority, as he decreed in the fourth commandment. And David showed a faith that made every effort to keep God's commandment to honor authorities. Taking a closer look at the reading, we start with verses 1 through the first half of 7. Saul resumed his hunt for David, raising a force, once again, of 3,000 of the best men in Israel. He made his way to En Gedi and was at a specific area known as the Rocks of the Wild Goats. It was an oasis, a gathering spot for animals, including domestic sheep. Saul just happened to choose a place to relieve himself that was the cave where David was hiding. So David's men at this opportunity immediately told David to kill Saul, but David refused. Instead, he simply sliced off the bottom part of Saul's outer robe and kept it. Apparently, the king had taken off this outer robe and laid it aside. David also reprimanded his men and wouldn't let them kill Saul either. Then in the second half of 7 through 15, Saul leaves the cave and David followed him and called to him, and he acknowledged Saul as the king by bowing down to the ground. David's actions, I can't talk very well tonight, David's actions emphasized his respect for God's choice of Saul and the authority vested in the king by divine prerogative. David's words here, it's one of the longest quotations of David, certainly the longest one in this book of the Bible. David's words quoted at length are an indictment of Saul for unjustly seeking his life. And in so doing, David masterfully proclaimed the law to a sinner, Saul, who had been intent on defying God. David's self-restraint and pity on the vulnerable king also modeled the gospel. David could have claimed the kingdom for himself at this point. He would have been justified in so doing, but he didn't. He had the mind of Jesus Christ, who being the very incarnate Son of God, did not use his equality with God for his own purposes, selfishly, but he emptied himself and became a servant who was obedient unto death, even death on the cross. Therefore, God highly exalted him. And finally, in verses 16 through 22, Saul replies, and his words are also quoted at length. Saul called David my son, and Saul wept, showing that he understood that he had failed to act as a father ought to have acted toward his son-in-law and daughters. Saul acknowledged that David was more righteous than he, and that David would someday be king of Israel. This admission of guilt by Saul reveals that ever since the fall into sin, humanity is vengeful and selfish, and a sinful man does not normally treat his enemy as David treated Saul. David repaid good for the evil he had received. And Saul's recognition that David would one day be king moved him to ask that David would not take revenge against Saul's house, his descendants. So David swore an oath to that effect, and they both parted ways. David would do his best to keep his oath by honoring his covenant with Jonathan. Ultimately, though, most of Saul's family was killed by the Gibeonites. However, even so, David still showed respect for Saul and Jonathan by having their remains interred in Zelah. And it's a long story, and we'll talk more about this later, but we see also David's intent in how he treated Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. Now that is a long saga, and even in this one incident, we see that in the life of David, there were so many ups and downs and twists and turns, and you can't make this stuff up. It really is amazing reading, and think of all of it really ultimately pointing forward to Jesus Christ. And you see how amazing God's love is in through all of these twists and turns, steering the course of history so that we would have as our Savior the Son of God, David's descendant, according to the flesh, Jesus Christ. Now may God be with you and bless you. I'll look forward